The road had no name on any map that Sergeant Cole Harris had ever been handed. The men called it what it was: a wound in the earth, torn open by tracks and wheels and the indifferent passage of war, filled now with the brown water of a February thaw that made every mile feel like wading through the bottom of a river. The trees on either side stood close and bare, their black branches laced together overhead like the fingers of men who had nothing left to pray for. Harris pressed his eye to the commander's periscope and watched the road ahead dissolve into gray mist. Somewhere behind him, 3 Sherman tanks followed at 50-yard intervals, their engines a low, familiar grumble that he felt in his back teeth more than heard. But it was the machine beneath him that occupied his mind. The one he had lived inside for the better part of 6 weeks, learned its sounds the way a man learns the breathing of someone sleeping beside him. The M26 Pershing. They had started calling her Iron Widow sometime in January, though no one could say exactly who had first spoken the name aloud. Kowal had stenciled it on the gun mantlet in crooked letters one evening outside Aachen, and it had stuck the way nicknames always stick, because it was true in some way that couldn't be explained. "Road's getting worse," Kowal said from below. His voice carried the flat, practical tone of a man reporting weather. Chester Kowal had been driving tanks since North Africa, and he spoke of bad roads the way a carpenter speaks of warped wood, as a condition to be managed, not complained about. "Keep her steady," Harris said, 2 miles to the crossroads. In the loader's seat, Damon Turner shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose. He was 20 years old, from a small town in Georgia that Harris had never heard of, and he had the look that all young soldiers eventually acquired. Not fear exactly, but a permanent, low-grade alertness, like a dog that has been startled too many times and can no longer fully relax. This was his 4th week in the field. His hands, Harris had noticed, were almost never still. "You doing all right back there, Turner?" "Yes, Sergeant." "You sure?" A pause. "Getting there." Eddie Novak, the gunner, said nothing. Novak rarely said anything when they were moving. He sat with his face close to the gun sight and his hands resting on the elevation wheel with a stillness that Harris had come to trust completely. Novak was from Chicago, the son of a machinist, and he treated the 90mm gun with the focused reverence of a man who understood precisely what a tool was capable of when handled correctly. In 3 engagements since they had taken the Pershing, he had not missed a single aimed shot. Wally Burns, in the radio operator's seat, was eating. He was almost always eating something: crackers, tinned fruit, hard candy pulled from pockets that seemed to have no bottom. Harris had stopped remarking on it. A man needed his rituals. "Sergeant," Burns spoke with his mouth full, but his voice carried a different weight now. "Cortez is calling back from point. Says he's got something. Movement at the wood line, eastern side, maybe 600 yards ahead." Harris straightened. His hand found the hatch rim above him. "Novak." "Already looking," Novak said quietly. The mist hung in the trees like dirty wool. The fields on the eastern side of the road ran flat and open for perhaps 200 yards before the forest rose. Old growth, thick-trunked, the kind of forest that swallowed light and sound and returned nothing. Harris studied the tree line through the periscope and felt the particular silence that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. He had learned in France that silence on a battlefield was not empty. It was full. It was the held breath of men who were waiting. "Kowal, slow to half." The Pershing eased, the engine note dropped. Beneath them, the churned road continued its patient attempt to swallow the tracks. Harris keyed the radio. "Cortez, hold your position. Do not advance. Repeat, hold." He looked at the tree line again. A crow lifted from the upper branches of a pine at the forest's edge, black against the pale sky, climbing without urgency, as though it had simply decided it preferred to be elsewhere. Harris had learned to pay attention to birds. "Novak," he said, "load AP." Behind him, Turner moved without hesitation. The dull, heavy sound of an armor-piercing round being seeded,
the breach closing with a sound like a vault. The crow was gone, the mist moved, and then the tree line opened up. The first round came from the eastern woodline at a downward angle, which meant the Panther was hull down behind the rise at the forest's edge. A good position, a patient position, the position of a crew that had chosen their ground and waited for someone to walk onto it. The shell passed over the lead Sherman and struck the road surface 30 yards ahead of Iron Widow with a concussion that Harris felt in his chest before he heard it. A pressure wave that preceded the sound the way lightning precedes thunder. "Contact east!" Burns was already shouting into the radio. "Armor, east woodline, 600! "Novak, traverse right!" Harris had the hatch open and his head above the rim before he had finished the sentence, because the periscope gave him angles but not depth, and depth was what he needed now. The cold air hit his face like a thrown cloth. Somewhere behind him, the Shermans were breaking formation, their engines rising in pitch, commanders shouting over the company net in overlapping bursts of noise and instruction. The Panther fired again.
This time, Harris saw the muzzle flash, a pale orange bloom in the gray trees, low and wide, the long barrel of the AUSF-G catching the flat February light for just a fraction of a second before the smoke folded over it. The round struck the first Sherman in the column. Harris heard the impact, a sound entirely unlike the sound in training films, not a clean metallic ring, but something duller and more final, like a door being slammed in an empty house. And then the Sherman stopped moving and began to burn from the engine compartment with a dark chemical smoke that the wind pulled immediately northward. 600, slightly south of center, hull down! Harris dropped back into the cupola. "Novak, you have him?" "I have him." Novak's voice was the same as it always was. Quiet, concentrated. The voice of a man threading a needle. "Fire when ready." The 90mm spoke. The recoil moved through the entire hull, a disciplined shudder, and Turner was already clearing the spent casing before the gun had finished its return stroke, his movements automatic, rehearsed beyond the point where thought was required. Novak called his own shot. Short, right, adjusting. And Harris was already back above the hatch rim, watching the impact throw frozen earth at the edge of the tree line, 20 yards from the Panther's position. "Driver, forward and left! Get us off this road!" Kowal pulled Iron Widow left into the field without a word, the tracks biting into the soft ground, the hull tilting as the right side rode up onto the road's embankment and then dropped back down into the field. The going was immediately worse. The thawed soil grabbed at the tracks like something living, but the road was a killing ground, and the field was not, or was less so, and Harris chose less so. The Panther shifted. Harris caught the movement, the long hull sliding back behind the tree line, repositioning, the commander over there making the same calculations Harris was making, looking for the angle that ended the conversation. A second Panther emerged, further south along the woodline, lower, partially screened by a hedgerow that had been cut back in autumn and grown into a tangle of bare branches. "Second contact, south, 100 yards from the first." Harris keyed the company net. "Bravo 2, swing south, engage the second vehicle, I'll take the first." Whether Bravo 2 heard him or not, he couldn't know, because in the next moment, the Southern Panther fired and the round struck Iron Widow along the left side of the hull near the forward drive sprocket, and the world became noise and motion and the particular violence of mechanical failure at speed. The track, 112 links of manganese steel, each link weighing more than a grown man could comfortably lift, came apart under the tension of the hit, and the Pershing lurched hard to the left side dropping as though the ground had opened beneath it, and Kowal was fighting the controls, pulling right, but there was nothing to pull against, and the tank slewed and stopped. "Track's gone! Left track! She's gone!" Kowal's voice had risen but not broken. "We're not going anywhere, Sergeant," Harris assessed in the space of 2 heartbeats. They were stopped in the open field, hull angled, the left side low and exposed. The gun still worked. The engine still ran. But a tank that could not move was not a tank. It was a pillbox, and pillboxes died in place. "Novak, keep firing. Turner, burn rate. I want rounds in the air. He dropped down and grabbed the radio handset. All stations, Iron Widow is immobilized. Grid. He read the coordinates from the map board. We need smoke, and we need it now. Novak fired again, and again. Each shot deliberate, unhurried. The gun tracking the first Panther as it tried to find a new angle through the trees. Burns was already pulling the smoke canisters from their bracket. Harris looked at Turner. The young man's face was filmed with sweat, despite the cold. His jaw set, his hands moving without trembling. Their eyes met for a moment, the look that passes between men who have just understood, simultaneously, that the situation has changed in a way that cannot be unchanged. "Good man," Harris said quietly. "Keep loading." The smoke came in gray-white billows from 3 canisters that Burns had pitched through his hatch with the practiced underhand of a man who had done it before and knew that thinking too long about it only made your arm shake. The wind was light and merciful. It held the screen roughly in place, spreading it northward along the field, thickening between Iron Widow and the tree line until the Panther's position became a shadow behind a curtain. "Novak, cease fire! Save the rounds!" Harris was already moving, climbing down from the cupola into the fighting compartment, crouching between the gun breech and the ammunition rack. The space inside the Pershing was tight in the way that all tanks were tight. Not cramped exactly, but intimate, every surface close enough to touch, the smell of propellant and machine oil, and 5 men's bodies woven into the steel itself. He pulled the demolition kit from its bracket behind Turner's seat. The kit contained 2 blocks of prepared explosive charge, a friction igniter, and 45 inches of safety fuse. Enough, under normal conditions, to destroy the gun breech, the radio equipment, and, if placed correctly at the ammunition, to render the vehicle irreparable. Harris examined the igniter. The friction wire had corroded at the crimp. It was a small thing, a manufacturing defect, or moisture that had worked its way into the housing during one of the river crossings 2 weeks prior, or simply the accumulated bad luck that attached itself to equipment the way rust attached itself to iron. He pulled the wire. It moved freely, without resistance, without the sharp mechanical snap that meant ignition. He pulled it again. Nothing. "Sergeant!" Novak had turned in his seat. His face was calm in the particular way that faces become calm when the available options have been reduced to a number that can be counted on one hand. "They're moving up. I can hear the engine. They're coming out of the tree line." Harris tried the second igniter from the kit's spare pocket. The wire pulled clean through, the crimp split, and the entire assembly came apart in his hand like something that had never been meant to hold together. Outside, through the hull, he could hear it now. The distinctive sound of a Maybach engine under load, the deep, uneven note of a Panther moving at speed over soft ground, the squealing of its road wheels as the driver pushed it across the field. And beneath that, further south, a second engine. They were coming in a spread, using the smoke the same way Harris had intended to use it, as concealment for movement, as the margin between being seen and not being seen. "Koval, can you give me anything? Any movement at all?" A pause that lasted less than 3 seconds, but felt considerably longer. "Negative, Sergeant. Left final drive is jammed solid. She's not moving." Harris set the useless demolition kit on the floor of the fighting compartment and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his crew, Koval's broad shoulders visible through the driver's hatch, Novak watching him with steady eyes, Turner holding a round he hadn't been asked to load yet, Burns with his hand on the radio handset, waiting. 4 men, 1 broken machine, 2 enemy vehicles converging through thinning smoke. He had been in the war long enough to know that there was a particular kind of decision that did not feel like a decision at all, that arrived already made, already inevitable, needing only to be acknowledged. This was that kind of moment. Every second spent inside the hull was a second closer to the point where the smoke cleared and the Panther's gunner found his angle, and the decision was made for them by someone else entirely. "We're getting out," Harris said. "Novak, spike the gun sight. Turner, Burns, out through the loader's hatch. Move low, move fast.
Head for the ditch along the northern field edge. Koval, driver's hatch, same direction. He picked up the Thompson from its mount beside the commander's seat. Leave everything that's not attached to your body. Move now. Turner went first, the loader's hatch swinging open, a rectangle of pale gray sky appearing above them, the cold rushing in. Burns went directly behind him. Harris heard their boots on the hull, heard Burns curse once as he dropped into the field mud, heard nothing after that, which was the sound he wanted to hear. Novak took 11 seconds to damage the gun sight with the barrel of his sidearm. 3 strikes, precise and deliberate, the optics cracking and splintering. And then he was moving, pulling himself up through the commander's cupola because the gunner's hatch was blocked by the traversed turret. Koval came last from the driver's compartment. Harris went up through the cupola and crouched on the hull for one moment only, looking back toward the tree line through the thinning smoke. He could see the Panther clearly now. It had come fully out of the tree line and was crossing the field at a cautious pace, its long 75mm barrel sweeping slowly left to right, like the head of something that was smelling the air.
The smoke between them was thin enough now to see through, but thick enough still to obscure detail, and Harris understood that the Panther's commander could see the shape of Iron Widow, but perhaps not yet the open hatches, perhaps not yet the absence of movement that would tell him the crew was gone. Harris dropped off the hole into the mud. The cold hit him fully, the wet February cold that had no mercy in it, that came up through the boots and settled in the knees and made every movement feel slightly slower than intended. He ran low along the left side of the hole, keeping the bulk of the Pershing between himself and the Panther, his boots punching through the thin ice crust that had formed overnight over the field mud and sinking 4 inches with every step. Ahead of him, through the last wisps of smoke, he could make out the figures of his crew moving toward the drainage ditch that ran along the northern edge of the field. Turner's tall frame, Burns's shorter one, Koval moving with the rolling, deliberate stride of a very large man who had decided that running was undignified, but fast walking was entirely acceptable. Novak was waiting at the ditch's edge, lying flat, his face turned back toward Harris. Harris reached him and went down into the ditch without slowing, the frozen mud crumbling under his hands, the cold water at the bottom soaking immediately through his trousers to the knee. He pressed his back against the ditch wall and looked back across the field. The Panther had stopped. It sat perhaps 180 yards from Iron Widow, its engine idling, the commander's hatch open and a figure visible in the cupola, a helmeted silhouette, motionless, studying the abandoned Pershing with the careful attention of a man who has learned that stillness is its own form of intelligence. The second Panther had halted at the field's southern edge, its barrel trained northward, covering its companion. They knew. Harris watched the commander in the cupola reach for something, binoculars probably, and raise them toward the Pershing, and he felt, in that moment, a complicated emotion that he could not have named precisely. It was not shame. It was something closer to the feeling of leaving a thing unfinished, of walking away from a task that the circumstances had made impossible to complete, knowing that the impossibility was real and documented and witnessed, and that none of that made it feel any better. "Sergeant," it was Novak, barely a whisper. "We need to move. The smoke's gone." Harris looked once more at Iron Widow. She sat in the field at her awkward leftward angle, the broken track splayed behind her like a shed skin, the hull unmarked except for the impact scar along the forward left sponson where the Panther's round had torn away the track. The 90mm gun was elevated slightly. Novak had left it that way, pointed at nothing, at the gray sky, at the general direction of a war that was still going on without them. He turned away and moved along the ditch. They reached the company position 40 minutes later, working north through the field ditch and then east through a stand of pine that gave them cover to the road. The Shermans of the column had pulled back 300 yards and taken up a defensive line behind a low stone wall that bordered a farm field. Captain Aldrich met Harris at the wall with an expression that asked the question before his mouth did. "Iron Widow's down," Harris said. "Left track. We couldn't fire it." Aldrich looked at him steadily. He was a careful man, Aldrich. Not cold, but disciplined in the way he distributed his reactions, as though he kept them in a limited supply and spent them only where they would do the most good. The demolition charge? Igniter failed. Both of them. Harris held his gaze. "She's sitting in the field intact. Engine running when we left her." A silence passed between them that contained several things: the acknowledgement of bad luck, the inventory of consequences, the unspoken question of what the Germans would do with a machine they had almost certainly never seen up close. "We'll call in artillery," Aldrich said. But the artillery request went through 3 levels of coordination, and by the time the guns were cleared to fire, the Panther had moved Iron Widow. Pushed her, Harris would later learn, with its own hull, nudging her backward across the field toward the tree line over the course of 2 hours. Slowly, carefully, the way you move something valuable that you do not yet fully understand, but intend to. The shells fell on an empty field. In the ditch where Harris had pressed his back against the frozen mud, the cold water continued its patient work, filling the boot prints one by one, smoothing the edges, returning the ground to a condition that suggested no one had ever been there at all. Hauptmann Wilhelm Krauss came around the front of the Pershing slowly, the way a man walks around something he is not yet ready to form an opinion about. His boots left deep impressions in the field mud. His hands were clasped behind his back. He had removed his gloves and held them there, folded together, and the cold reddened his knuckles without his appearing to notice. The machine sat at the edge of the tree line where they had pushed her the previous evening, half-screened by the first row of pines. In the flat morning light, she looked enormous, broader in the hull than a Panther, lower in profile than a Tiger, with a solidity to her lines that suggested she had been designed by men who had thought carefully about what a tank was actually required to do and had made their decisions accordingly. Oberleutnant Max Ditter stood to Krauss's right with his arms crossed and his chin slightly raised, the posture of a man preparing to be unimpressed. 90 millimeter, said Feldwebel Otto Hagen, crouching beside the gun barrel with a wooden measuring rod he had produced from somewhere inside his coat. He spoke the way he always spoke, quietly, precisely, without editorial. "The barrel length is considerable. The muzzle brake design is more efficient than ours." He paused, measuring. "Considerably more efficient." "It's heavier than a Panther," Ditter said. "By approximately 4 tons, yes." Hagen stood and made a notation in the small book he kept in his breast pocket. "But the weight distribution is better managed. Look at the track width, Herr Oberleutnant, and the road wheel arrangement." He gestured along the running gear. "No interleaving, simpler, faster to repair in the field." Ditter looked at the wheels without expression. Krauss had stopped at the front of the hull and was examining the armor plate. He pressed his palm flat against the upper glacis, feeling the cold steel, the slight texture of the rolled surface. 70 degrees of slope, Hagen had estimated, though he intended to measure it properly before he wrote anything definitive. The thickness beneath that slope was a question Hagen was still working toward answering. "The crew abandoned her," Krauss said. "They tried to fire the demolition charge." "The igniter failed," Hagen confirmed. "I found the components on the fighting compartment floor, both spent without ignition. A manufacturing defect, most likely, or moisture damage." He allowed himself the faintest suggestion of a dry expression. "Fortunate for us." Ditter uncrossed his arms and moved to the turret, reaching up to touch the gun mantlet where the stenciled letters read Iron Widow. He studied them for a moment. "A name," he said. "They name their vehicles," Krauss said. "The British do as well." "Sentiment." "Perhaps." Krauss moved to the turret side and looked up at the commander's cupola. The wide, low profile of it, the number and placement of the vision blocks. He counted them without speaking. More than a Panther commander had. A better field of view. He noted this and said nothing. Hagen was already at the engine deck, his notebook open, his pencil moving. I want a full written assessment, Kraus said to him. Armor, armament, optics, automotive. Everything you can determine without cutting into her. 3 days, Hagen said. Perhaps 4. Ditter turned from the turret. 3 days examining a broken American tank while the front moves. Kraus looked at him with the patience of a man who has survived 4 years of war by paying attention to things that other men dismissed. The front will still be there, Ditter, he said. This, he placed his hand on the hull, may tell us something the front cannot. Hagen spent the first full day inside the tank. He brought a lantern, his notebook, a steel measuring tape, and a small engineer's reference guide that he had carried since his years at the Krupp Works in Essen, its cover worn soft as cloth, its margins filled with his own cramped annotations. He worked methodically, compartment by compartment, the way he had once worked on factory floors, without hurry, without assumption, letting the object speak before he formed his conclusions. The fighting compartment surprised him first. The space was tighter than he had expected given the hull's external dimensions, but it was organized with a logic he recognized and respected. The ammunition stowage was partially wet. The Americans had designed a system to contain propellant fires that Hagen had not encountered before, and he spent 40 minutes alone examining it, sketching the arrangement twice from different angles. He wrote in his notebook, "Deliberate design decision, not improvisation. Someone thought carefully about what happens when a round ignites inside a closed hull." He measured the gun breech. He measured the elevation and traverse mechanisms. He sat in the gunner's seat and looked through the damaged sight. Novak's 3 pistol strikes had cracked the primary optic, but left enough of the housing intact for Hagen to understand the magnification system and the reticle design. He wrote, "Superior to our current standard. Cleaner graduation marks. Better low-light performance likely." On the second day, Kraus came alone, in the early afternoon, and sat on the hull while Hagen worked below. They did not speak for a long time. The forest around them was quiet. A deep, resinous winter quiet, broken occasionally by distant artillery that had the muffled, inconsequential quality of something happening in another world. "Tell me what you think," Kraus said finally. Hagen emerged from the driver's hatch and sat on the glacis plate, his notebook on his knee. He was a lean man of 43, gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading machinery rather than people, and had found the habit difficult to break. "The armor," he said. "Front plate. I estimate 100 millimeters at approximately 46 degrees of slope. The effective resistance is closer to 140 millimeters of vertical plate. Our 75 cannot penetrate that at any combat range." He paused. "The long 88 from the Königstiger can, at close range, with favorable angle." Kraus was quiet. "The gun," Hagen continued, "fires the same caliber as our own 88, approximately. The muzzle velocity is somewhat lower, but the projectile is heavier. At 500 meters, the penetration values are," he consulted his notes, "comparable to the KWK-43, perhaps marginally less, but the difference is not significant in practical terms." Ditter had appeared at the tree line without either man noticing him approach. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, listening. "So it matches a Tiger II," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has heard something he wanted to argue with and cannot find the argument. "In most respects," Hagen said carefully, "yes. The Panther is faster." "The Panther is faster," Hagen agreed. "And the Panther's gun is excellent. I am not saying this machine is without weaknesses." He looked at his notebook, then looked up. "I am saying that whoever designed her understood what the weaknesses of previous designs had been and addressed them, systematically. That is what concerns me." Ditter said nothing. Kraus looked out through the trees toward the field where Iron Widow had been stopped. The broken track still lay there in the mud, links scattered across 50 yards of frozen ground like the vertebrae of something enormous. "How many of these do they have?" he said. It was not quite a question. Hagen closed his notebook. Outside, the distant artillery had stopped, and the silence that replaced it felt different from the silence before. Fuller, more attentive, as though the afternoon itself was listening for an answer that none of them could give. "Enough," Hagen said quietly. "I think enough." The replacement track links arrived on the third day, brought forward on a requisitioned farm cart by two exhausted pioneers who had driven through the night from the supply depot at Zülpich. Hagen received them in the gray morning light, counting each link with his hand, calculating. He needed 63 links to complete the repair. They had brought 51. He stood in the mud beside the cart and looked at the links for a long moment. 51, he said, to no one in particular. One of the pioneers shrugged with the eloquence of a man who had delivered what he had been given and considered his responsibility discharged. They turned the cart around and went back the way they had come, the horse picking its way carefully through the ruts, its breath rising in white clouds in the cold morning air. Hagen went to find Kraus. He located him in the farmhouse at the edge of the tree line that served as the battle group's command post. A low stone building with a cracked chimney and windows covered with canvas, smelling of damp wool and burnt ersatz coffee. Kraus was at the table with his maps, a radio operator in the corner maintaining a low, continuous murmur of communication with the regiment. 51 links, Hagen said from the doorway. Kraus looked up. He read the implication immediately, the way experienced soldiers read all implications. Fast, without visible emotion, already moving toward the practical response before the feeling had time to form. "How many more do you need?" 12, possibly 14, depending on the condition of the drive sprocket housing. "I won't know until I've cleared the damage further. I'll request another shipment." "The roads, I know the roads." Kraus's voice was not sharp, but it carried a finality that closed the subject. He made a notation on his map margin and returned his attention to the broader picture spread across the table. Hagen remained in the doorway, reading the map from where he stood. The American lines had moved. In the 2 days since Iron Widow had been pushed into the tree line, the front had shifted with a momentum that the map's penciled arrows rendered almost gentle. Clean lines advancing across paper, bearing no relationship to what those lines meant in mud and noise and the exhaustion of men who had been moving and fighting without adequate sleep since the Ruhr crossing. "They're closer," Hagen said. "Yes. How much time do we have?" Kraus studied the map for a moment, with the expression of a man performing a calculation that has too many variables and too few reliable inputs. 2 days, he said finally. "Perhaps 3 if the roads slow them." Hagen nodded slowly. 2 days was enough, if the links arrived. If the drive sprocket housing was undamaged. If the weather held and the ground refroze sufficiently to work on, a chain of conditions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one dependent on the ones before it. He went back to the Pershing. Ditter was there, standing beside the broken track with his hands in his pockets, watching 2 mechanics from the Panther crews working at the drive sprocket with tools they had not quite been designed for the task. The American fastening system was slightly different from the German standard. Not dramatically, but enough to require improvisation, and improvisation took time. "It can be done," Ditter said when Hagen approached. He said it with the conviction of a man who needs to believe something and has decided that conviction is a reasonable substitute for certainty. "With the right links and sufficient time, yes," Hagen said. Ditter turned to look at him. In the pale daylight, his face showed something that Hagen had not seen there before. Not the defensive self-assurance of the previous days, but something more honest and less comfortable. "You said enough," Ditter said. "The other day, when Kraus asked how many of these they had." "I did." "What did you mean, exactly?" Hagen picked up one of the spare track links from the ground and turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the machining. It was good steel, not exceptional, but consistent. The consistency of mass production done correctly, done at scale, done by an industrial system that had not been bombed into intermittent operation and was not running on diminishing reserves of everything. "I meant," he said carefully, "that the question of how many is perhaps less important than the question of how quickly they can make more." Ditter was quiet for a long time. One of the mechanics struck something metal against the drive sprocket housing and cursed in a dialect from somewhere deep in Bavaria. "If we had their factories," Ditter said. It was not quite a complete sentence. "Yes," Hagen said. "If." The attack came at dawn on the 5th day. Harris heard it before he saw it. The particular orchestration of a coordinated armored advance, the overlapping engine notes building from the south and west simultaneously, the crump of supporting artillery walking forward in measured increments, the way a careful man climbs stairs. He was standing at the edge of the company's forward position in a ruined apple orchard, his breath visible in the cold air, a tin cup of coffee in his hand that had stopped being warm 20 minutes ago. Captain Aldrich appeared beside him. "3 Pershings, 2 platoons of infantry, tank destroyers on the flanks," he said. "We're going in to clear the wood line and recover what's ours." Harris set the cup on a broken fence post. "Iron Widow?" "If she's still there, and still in one piece, yes." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "You're with the lead element." In the tree line, Kraus heard it too. He had been awake since before first light, sitting with the radio operator, listening to the regiment's net deteriorate from organized communication into the fragmented, overlapping transmissions that meant the line was breaking in multiple places at once. The Americans had crossed the Ruhr in force 3 days prior. The roads behind him were no longer reliably open. The supply cart with the remaining track links had not arrived. He walked to the Pershing in the darkness before the attack began. Hagen was there already, working by lantern light, his breath fogging around his face, a wrench in his hand. The 51st link had been fitted. The drive sprocket housing had proved undamaged. What remained was 12 links. 12 links and perhaps 4 hours of work. And the sound coming from the south made it abundantly clear that 4 hours did not exist. "Leave it," Kraus said. Hagen looked up from the track. The lantern light caught the angles of his face and made him look older than his years. Or perhaps simply as old as the war had actually made him. "Another hour." "Leave it, Otto." It was the first time Kraus had used his given name. Hagen set the wrench down on the hull with a care that was almost ceremonious, and stood up slowly, his knees protesting the cold and the hours of crouching. He picked up his notebook from where it rested against the drive sprocket and put it in his breast pocket. Ditter arrived at a run, his coat unbuttoned, his face carrying the information before he spoke it. 2, perhaps 3 Pershings confirmed, coming from the southwest. Infantry with them. Mueller's Panther is already falling back. Kraus looked at Iron Widow one last time. She sat in the filtered darkness of the tree line, with her hull repaired, her turret intact, her gun pointing at the pale strip of sky visible through the canopy. 11 days of work, of measurement, of argument and revelation. Hagen's notebook full of numbers that told a story no one in Berlin wanted to hear. "We take the notes," Kraus said. "We take everything Hagen has written. The vehicle stays." Ditter opened his mouth and closed it again. "She was theirs before she was ours," Kraus said quietly. "She goes back." Harris came through the tree line at the head of the advance, on foot ahead of the tanks, moving through the pines with his Thompson across his chest and 4 infantrymen spread behind him. The sounds of the brief engagement to the south were already diminishing. 2 Panthers pulling back east, a tank destroyer exchanging fire with something in a farm lane. The whole German position collapsing with the speed of a line that had been held too long with too little. He saw her between the trees. Iron Widow sat exactly where the aerial observation had indicated, hull down at the tree line's inner edge, the broken track partially reassembled, tools laid out beside the drive sprocket with a neatness that stopped Harris for a moment. A lantern, extinguished but still warm when he touched the glass. a wrench. And beside the left track, set carefully upright against the hull as though someone had wanted it to be found and not damaged, a single track link. The 52nd, fitted but not fastened, the last thing Hagen's hands had touched before Kraus called him away. Harris crouched and picked it up. Behind him, Koval's voice came through the trees. "She's intact, Sergeant. Engine cold, but she's intact. They almost had the track." Harris turned the link in his hands. Good steel. He had held German steel before, in other contexts, and it was good steel, too. He set the link down beside the others and stood up. "Get Koval on the drive," he said. "Let's bring her home." They had her running by mid-afternoon. Koval completed the track repair in just under 3 hours, working with 2 mechanics from the recovery platoon who had brought the correct links and the correct tools, and the particular focused energy of men who know exactly what they are doing and have been given the space to do it. Harris watched from a distance, sitting on a fallen pine trunk at the tree line's edge, smoking one of the cigarettes that Burns had pressed into his hand without being asked. The forest around him was quiet in the way that places become quiet after violence has passed through them. Not peaceful, but emptied, as though the noise had consumed something that could not be immediately replaced. Somewhere to the east, artillery continued its conversation with the afternoon, but it was distant enough to be abstract, belonging to someone else's morning. He looked at the ground around the Pershing. The Germans had been thorough. Tool marks on the drive sprocket housing, carefully made, without the gouging haste of men working under pressure. At least, not until the end, where the final link showed the slight misalignment of a job interrupted. Bootprints in the frozen mud circling the hull in patterns that told a readable story. Here, someone had stood for a long time at the front glacis. Here, at the turret side, repeated visits, the ground worn down by sustained attention. Here, at the engine deck, the careful, measured steps of someone who moved like an engineer. Harris ground out the cigarette and walked to the turret. The gun sight had been struck. He had known that from Novak's report. But everything else inside the fighting compartment had been handled with a restraint that surprised him. The ammunition remaining in the racks had not been removed. The radio had not been further damaged beyond Novak's own work on it. The personal effects that Turner had left wedged beside the loader's seat, a folded letter, a small photograph, had been moved and replaced with a deliberateness that suggested they had been examined and consciously returned. He picked up the photograph. Turner's mother and 2 sisters on a porch somewhere in Georgia, squinting into summer light. He put it in his own breast pocket to return it. In the corner of the fighting compartment, tucked between the ammunition rack and the hull wall where it would not be immediately visible, but would certainly be found during any methodical search, was a folded piece of paper. Harris unfolded it. It was a page from a small notebook, graph paper, the kind used by engineers, the lines fine and regular. The writing was in German, which Harris could not read with any fluency, but the numbers needed no translation. Column after column of measurements, penetration estimates, comparison figures, armor thickness notations with degree markings, ammunition performance calculations. At the bottom of the page, a single line of text, written in a different hand from the technical notations, a heavier, more deliberate script, as though written slowly and with intention. Harris folded the page and put it in his pocket beside Turner's photograph. He climbed out of the hull and stood on the glacis in the thin afternoon light, looking south across the field where the engagement had taken place 11 days before. The frozen mud still showed the scar of the Panther's push, the furrow where Iron Widow had been moved, the scattered track links lying where they had fallen, half sunk now into the thawing ground. The Sherman that had burned was still there at the road's edge, its hull collapsed inward, the steel gone the particular orange-black of metal that has been through fire and come out changed. Kowal's voice rose from the driver's compartment. "She's ready, Sergeant. Want to take her out?" Harris looked at the field for another moment. Then he climbed down, walked around to the commander's hatch, and lowered himself into the cupola. The engine caught on the first attempt. The sound of it filled the tree line and rolled out across the open ground. Familiar, immediate, the sound of a machine that had been waiting without complaint and was ready to continue. The folded page from Hagen's notebook reached an intelligence officer at the First Army's forward headquarters 4 days later, passing through 3 sets of hands before arriving on a desk in a requisitioned schoolroom in a small town whose name Harris never learned. He had surrendered it at the battalion command post, along with a brief written account of what he had observed at the tree line: the tool marks, the boot patterns, the careful handling of the interior. The intelligence officer, a thin major from Massachusetts who wore his uniform as though it had been designed for someone slightly larger, read Harris's account twice and then looked up. "They spent how long with her?" "Best estimate, 11 days, Harris said. The major looked at the graph paper page for a long time without speaking. Harris watched him read the numbers, watched the moment when the major understood what he was looking at, the slight change in the set of his jaw that was the only visible evidence of the calculation being performed behind his eyes. "You can go, Sergeant," the major said. Harris went. Hagen's notebook made a different journey. Krauss had carried it personally during the retreat east, wrapped in oilcloth inside his map case, treating it with the careful attention he gave to things he considered genuinely important. At the regiment's new position, he submitted it through channels with a covering report that took him 2 evenings to write. Not because the facts were difficult to set down, but because the conclusions were, and he was a man who believed that conclusions, once committed to paper, acquired a permanence that obligated the writer to have been certain before writing them. The report stated, in the measured language of a professional soldier who had long since stopped confusing hope with analysis, that the M26 represented a fundamental shift in American armored capability, that its protection, armament, and mechanical reliability placed it broadly comparable to the heaviest German designs, that its design philosophy suggested a systematic study of previous failures, their own and the enemy's, and a deliberate, resourced response to each identified weakness. That the industrial implications of encountering such a vehicle in increasing numbers, given what was known of American productive capacity, required no elaboration. The report was received, acknowledged, and filed. Turner got his photograph back on a Tuesday, outside Cologne, while the crew was performing maintenance on Iron Widow's repaired track. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Harris with an expression that asked a question he didn't quite put into words. "Found it in the loader seat," Harris said. "Someone had put it back where you left it." Turner looked at the photograph again. His mother, his sisters, the Georgia porch in summer light. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket without speaking, and Harris did not press him, because some things did not require comment, and this was one of them. Novak rebuilt the gun sight with parts sourced from an ordnance depot and declared it superior to the original, which no one believed but everyone accepted because Novak's relationship with the gun was his own business. Burns found a source of decent coffee somewhere in the Cologne suburbs and declined to reveal it on the grounds that scarcity was the only thing keeping it decent. Kowal, when asked what he thought of the Germans' repair work on the track, considered the question for a long moment and said they had done a fair job with what they had, which from Kowal was the equivalent of a detailed technical commendation. The war continued east. Iron Widow moved with it, through the bridgehead at Remagen, through the flattened industrial towns of the Ruhr, through the long gray weeks of March, and into the uncertain, almost quiet of April, when the resistance became intermittent and the distances between engagements grew, and the men inside the hull began, cautiously and without discussing it directly, to think about what came after. Harris kept the folded page from Hagen's notebook. He could not read the German text at the bottom, the single line in the heavier hand, until a translator at the Army headquarters rendered it for him in late April, reading it aloud in a flat, careful voice as though the words required handling. It said, "The men who built this machine were thinking about the men who would have to fight in it. That is not nothing." Harris folded the page and put it back in his pocket. He thought about Hagen, The boot prints in the mud, the tools laid out with such care, the lantern still warm when he had touched the glass. A man who had been given 11 days with a machine that interested him deeply and had used every one of them. He thought about the 50-second track link set upright against the hull, the last thing, the almost. Outside, Iron Widow's engine idled in the April morning, patient and ready, waiting for whatever came next.